And we are live. Welcome to another episode of the New York Information Security Meetup. I have the great pleasure to introduce Raffi Jamgotchian, who is the CTO and president for Triada Networks. Thanks, Raffi, for joining. Much appreciated.
Thank you for having me, David.
So I always like to invite people that are knowledgeable in the cybersecurity space, but also entrepreneurs that decided to jump into the deep end and create your own business. So why don't we start with kind of your background and what you've done so far? You have a fascinating background with some very unique experiences, and why don't we start there?
Sure. I'm a computer engineer by trade. I studied computer engineering initially to be a control systems engineer. I would design circuits and software that controlled motors and various other things, and that put me in a job in the audiovisual industry for one of the bigger control systems manufacturers. I met some people on a job while doing a video conferencing project in IT management for a financial firm, and that was they. I didn't really understand. I didn't know IT. I didn't know networking, but I've been around computers since I was a young boy. My dad was a mainframe programmer, so I took the opportunity to work in finance in the IT industry and kind of moved up from there. Um, Worked there for over a dozen years until one of the managers tapped my shoulder and said, "Hey, look, I'm starting my own investment company. Can you come help me out?" And that's how we started our venture into building a new small business with him. And then 18 months later, I spun out and started Triada Networks to help other companies just like him, smaller investment firms, deal with their cybersecurity and IT systems. And that's my origin story.
Yeah, that's very cool. And wow, mainframe programmer. That's super cool. I mean, that stuff. These folks were hardcore. I think some of these mainframes were like
Still doing it. He's still doing it.
that's amazing.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, the thing is with these, there's so few people that actually know today. It's almost like security by obscurity.
Yeah.
Like how many people are, knowledgeable in the mainframe. And what is it like COBOL? What's the
Yeah,
programming language?
COBOL and JCL. It was the job control language that he used, and he's still doing it today for a major financial firm. So
Yeah, it's so cool.
yeah,
And it's amazing that they still use the same mainframes that they've
they
used
don't
so many
break.
years. They don't break in. And I think also it's the backbone for a lot of these, hardcore transactions. And then, it's very hard to put a stop, to that, and then kind of do a refresh and forklift these mainframes. It's almost
Yeah,
impossible.
you can change the limbs and the arms around the body, but the heart and the lungs and the circulatory system, that's what a lot of these large firms are still running on. And even the newer applications are just built a crust around what that old center core is, and they continue to develop it.
Yeah, it's amazing. Do you ever talk security? With your dad about the like the mainframes and how those things work? I'm assuming that some of them are not even connected to the outside world, or do
No,
they?
and most of the time they're not, and most of the time even less so. Even the direct access is no longer there. Where in the past, where you'd actually get terminal access, right now terminal access really limited to very specific operators, and nearly everything now is developed using web services and what have you. So there's a lot more. There's modernization, but the core systems are still running on that back end, and even some of the reports are still COBOL reports that just print out pages and pages of data.
Whether they kind of the
No
black
more
screen
punch
back.
cards though. So the punch cards are gone.
Those punch cards were cool, and just to be able to program with a punch card, to think about it, how when you make a mistake and you have to run it again,
Yeah,
you have to create the whole thing.
exactly.
Unbelievable. And now people complain about the fact that they have to recompile, and it takes a little time for that. Um, so tell me, investment firms, they have unique requirements from a cybersecurity
Sure.
perspective. Talk to me about that a bit. Like, what are kind of the main concerns? A lot of them run like these black box operations, and they're extremely paranoid. Is that a true statement?
Yes and no. I think it really depends on
Mhm.
the type of investment company they are. I came out on a buy side firm We didn't have an information security program. It was very new. Uh, I was I wouldn't say that I was the person, but we were one of the core people that started building out the information security program at that firm. Initial vulnerability management databases, building new firewalls, connecting the first connections to the internet. And that helped us kind of learn the process of what was going on. And then as we matured as a company and as we matured as a group, we also matured our processes. If you take a look at what's available today from an information point of view, so much more now that you can kind of run with. But at the time, there really wasn't a lot. And so because we knew that our companies, the company that we worked with, had a fiduciary responsibility to their investors, we took a very cautious approach about how we connected with various systems. And then, after 9/11, we started seeing the know your customer things coming out. Same thing with some of the regulations related to Graham Leach Bliley. And there was a lot more controls that had to be defined, and we were building them as we went. And now today we have these frameworks, at least, that we can kind of hang our hat on and say, okay, this is what we're following. But at the time, we were building them as we went, and so that was kind of the early stages of that. And so in the financial services, you think about what are the assets that you're protecting, and you want to make sure that you invest properly to protect those assets. So if you have assets that are worth a lot of money, it's worth spending the money to protect those assets.
Mm-hmm.
And I think many times companies will make that mismatch of a determination of whether they're spending too much to protect against something of low risk or low value, or vice versa, not spend enough to protect something of high risk or high value.
So when you mention frameworks, are you referring specifically to like NIST or other types of security frameworks?
Yeah, correct. Yeah, at the time there really was. I mean, there were some early ones. There was early ISO had some frameworks. We followed those for really around business continuity more than anything else. But today we have all these different frameworks. In fact, now probably way too many frameworks. And that makes it a little bit harder to say, hey, this is the one I'm going to hang my hat on for, but the important thing is find one that works for your company, adopt it, and then make it your own. Ultimately, you have to adopt it to what your needs are, what your regulatory needs are. So when we do it, when we work with a firm based on their size, we'll take a blending of frameworks and their regulations. FINRA is not super prescriptive, but there's some things that are prescriptive. FFIEC is a little bit more prescriptive. So there's these other parts that we connect in and say, okay, this is the framework that we're going to manage towards. These are then you build your policies on top of the framework. Then you build your procedures on top of those policies, and so forth and so on.
So interesting. So you mentioned a blend. Aren't these frameworks almost a bit of a blend anyway? Like there's a bit of an overlap to a lot of them.
Most of them are overlapped. I mean, if you look at, there's a number of ways that you can look at that structure. There's a organization, nonprofit organization or a free organization called Security Controls Framework. It's been put together by a number of other for-profit firms, but basically they have a large matrix of, here are hundreds of controls on one side of the spreadsheet, and across the top all the different regulations, and basically check boxes of where those match. So you can easily take, hey, these are my regulations that I need to follow, and these are all the controls for those regulations and that framework, and put together a matrix of what each control is and what things it checks off. This way, if today, you're all of a sudden you're now in Europe, and you need to expand into Europe, and you have to add the GDPR column, you can see which things you're already doing that matches up with those with that regulation, and thus shorten your time to deployment without having to redo everything.
Mhm. Interesting. Let's talk a bit about regulation. So these investment firms, despite the fact that they're not necessarily large, they still have to comply with certain
Correct.
regulations, right? As a financial,
Yeah.
um, and there's quite a overhead, like a burden to comply, like in terms of cost, in terms of the the controls they have to put in place. What is the role specifically for cybersecurity to comply with these controls and new regulations, and how these specifically investment firms that are not, they don't have the, kind of the capacity or the teams associated with running and being compliant, deal with these specific regulations?
Yeah, no, that's a excellent point. I mean, that's why Triada Networks really exists was is really for that purpose.
I teed you up on this one.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. So I wasn't very good at t-ball, but I can hit a ball off a stick. Yeah, definitely. So that's really kind of what happens in these larger firms where the regulations were originally developed for these bigger firms, and now I would say more in the last 5, 6, 7 years, we're seeing some more guidance from some of the regulators. Like FINRA has put together the small firm cybersecurity checklist. So the cybersecurity piece of it is a subset of the overall compliance requirements. So cybersecurity, if you think of it as a Venn diagram, there's the compliance requirements as a financial firm. There are all the cybersecurity things that any business should do, and there's an overlap between the two of them. So the way we look at it is we're really looking at that whole overlap. We're looking at not only the compliance and cybersecurity angle that work together, but also the things outside of compliance that are still, in our opinion, I hate to use the term, but lack of a better one, best practices, what we think a firm should do to protect even though it may not necessarily be spelled out in a regulation, which is why that's why we lean on these frameworks to give us some backbone around defining what those things are that a company will do. This way, when a regulator comes, or many times an investor will come and sit across the table from one of our clients and say, look, we're doing due diligence on you. We want to make sure you're doing everything you